Hello, and welcome to the evolution of testing, ensuring validity and equity when identifying advanced learners. My name is Emily Dolinsky, and I am the Senior Research Program Coordinator at the Johns Hopkins Center for Talented Youth. CTY is excited to offer these sessions to celebrate the 45th anniversary of CTY by highlighting our past, present, and future, as well as some of our recent research on advanced learners. In this session, we will be focusing on the evolution of testing, ensuring validity and equity when identifying advanced learners. I would like to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Amy Shelton, the Executive Director of CTY, and Dr. Kathryn Thompson, Director of Research. So with that, take it away.
Cool. Thank you so much, Emily. So before I get started with this presentation today, I wanted to pose a question for everyone. And that is, what comes to mind when you hear the word testing? So on the screen in front of you, you should see a QR code. And if you would please scan that, type your word or multiple words in that come to mind whenever you hear the word testing. And we'll take a peek at a word cloud of what everybody thinks about when hearing the word testing. Right, a lot of different words. So, stress popped up is really big there. Stress, definitely testing can be stressful. Anxiety assessment, another good word. Grades, constructs, latent. Oh, I like that stuff. Data, standardized. Okay. It's a lot of great words. A lot of interesting things that people think about whenever we hear the word testing. Not just its definition, but what kind of feelings it invokes from us. I think having done something similar to this in the past, it does tend to be a very stressful experience that testing invokes. So it's interesting to see all the different ways that people kind of think about it in terms of feelings. But then there's also kind of things that we associate it with, different things we associate with testing, like assessment and grades, standardization, those perfectionism, measuring, latent constructs, all those different types of things. Let me go ahead and stop sharing that. So testing, it can be a really challenging word to define, and really we all conceptualize it in different ways. And really we bring to the table all of our different types of experiences that we've had with testing in the past. It's a huge thing in the United States to do standardized testing at the end of every year for children in public schools. And so it kind of brings about all of these different feelings and emotions. You might have had really good experience with testing in the past, especially if you're a very good test taker. But sometimes it can be really stressful. For myself, I started to become interested in the idea of testing because I always tend to second guess myself, especially on multiple choice questions. And so for me, I really wanted to dive into what was causing me to second guess myself, but then also really take a look at and reflect on, are we measuring what we're intending to measure with a specific test? And what are all the different sorts of things that can influence our test scores and cause us to make not so great interpretations about those test scores. And so within the field of psychometrics and test development, we have specific ways of defining what a test is or what testing is. But what if you just looked for the definition of testing online? So in the Cambridge Dictionary, testing is defined as the act or practice of giving a test to measure someone's knowledge or ability. Whenever you look at a few other sources like the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, a test is something that measures the skills, knowledge, intelligence, capacities, or aptitude of an individual or a group. We also often see, people using ChatGPT, the rise of AI. So I also decided to ask ChatGPT, how do you define testing? And so really here, testing is the process of evaluating a system, product, or component to determine its functionality, performance, and reliability. And it goes on from there. And while ChatGPT's version, it might sound a little bit different than what we're talking about today, it does include some important terms that I think are very interesting, things like performance and reliability that we often associate with tests. So again, there's many different ways that we can conceptualize testing. But personally, for me, I do like the Cambridge dictionary version or definition of testing. It comes pretty close to what we'll be talking about today. Specifically, we administer something like a task or an assignment or a test itself, different items in an attempt to measure a person's knowledge about a topic, whether they already learned that topic or their ability to do something in the future. And in the case for advanced learners, we administer tests specifically in an attempt to try and identify the right opportunities for students to match them to their needs and help them succeed. So where did this idea of testing originate, though? How and why did we decide to develop tests in an attempt to measure advanced academic learning potential and identify advanced learners? Well, our story, it really starts quite a long time ago. In fact, mental testing or mental ability testing has been going on for longer than really most of us can imagine. The origins, in fact, can be linked back to ancient China as well as ancient Greece. And both civilizations, they assessed their citizens on a specific set of skills or traits. And the scores from these tests told them whether their citizens were good members of society and whether they were ready for things like vocational work, so whether they would be a good citizen and whether they would do good at their job. Now, specifically in ancient China, which was all the way back in about 2200 BCE, the Chinese, they used an oral civil service exam to assess whether civil servants should continue in their appointed positions within the government. And this eventually evolved into exams to select citizens for certain types of civil service positions. Now, specifically, if we move forward a little bit in that timeline around the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE, we see some interesting different ways that the Chinese are implementing these exams. So rather than going from oral exams, they went then to written exams, which provided a little bit more standardization. And so these exams included a variety of topics and domains, such as music, archery, horsemanship, writing, all different kinds of things. And all of these domains were valued by the Chinese because they were important aspects of being a civil servant. Similarly, with the ancient Greeks, they also developed tests that showcased what was important to them in terms of being an ideal Greek citizen. And really, the Greeks tended to focus on two different domains. One was the physical domain, and then one was more on mental ability. So whereas physical ability, it might have been more about running and leaping, mental ability tended to include things like arithmetic, astronomy, even morality. So some philosophy aspects in there as well. One of the interesting pieces that the Greeks distinguished between when they were creating these tests and interpreting the test scores as a result of these tests and really thinking about what are we doing with these test scores, what is the purpose, was really this idea between achievement and aptitude. And so with achievement, we're asking the question about, did you learn the material? So achievement, again, has to do with measuring what a person has already learned. In other words, we were trying to answer this question of, did you again learn the material? And so some typical examples of tests that we see here, end of course exams, certification exams, as well as AP or advanced placement types of tests. And again, all of these tests showcase the knowledge that a person has learned, whether that be due to a course or curriculum that they learned or anything like that. Now, aptitude, on the other hand, it had to do more with measuring a person's potential to learn. So not just whether they learned the material, but what is their potential to learn the material. And so more specifically, they were interested in answering this question of, how will you perform in the future? So some examples of these could include cognitive abilities tests or IQ or intelligence tests. And so those were some different types of more aptitude tests about how they would perform in the future. Some other types of tests which we tend to think about as kind of being this in-between stage are things like the SAT or the ACT, where these scores, they're intended to help us to predict how well a student will perform in college, so in the future. But the scores also have been used in the past as a way to assess whether students have learned the material and are sufficiently prepared for college. And this gets back to this original intended purpose and use of the test score. So really, what are we going to use that test score for? So a test, it might have been developed to measure and infer a specific thing, such as how well students will do in college. But we can also use it for other purposes, that same test for multiple types of reasons or purposes. However, if we do that, we have to be very careful. We need to collect sufficient evidence to support those interpretations and uses. And we also really need to think about the consequences associated with certain types of inferences, interpretations, and uses that we have or make from those test scores. So, for example, many tests that have been developed are for specific populations or have specific populations in mind. And it's going to be therefore tailored to those specific populations of students used for them, and it's going to often favor them in some way. And so this whole idea is known as validity. And so really what we're trying to do is create a validity argument for any sorts of score interpretations or uses that we have for a specific test. And I just wanted to bring this to our attention, as this is going to be a very common theme throughout the presentation. It's kind of going back to what was the intended original use for these tests and why they were developed. So now from BCE, ancient Greece, ancient China, I'm going to jump ahead quite a bit in our timeline. So I'm not going to cover every single tiny detail in testing, but specifically I'm going to jump to around the 18th century. And this is when people became interested in something known as individual differences. And so while mental ability tests have been developed and used for a variety of different purposes across the years, one of the first known mentions of a systematic investigation of this idea of individual differences began with Kinbrook at the Greenwich Observatory. So he was an astronomer, and he noticed that his fellow astronomers had different reaction times to different types of astronomical events. And so what he was interested in is he actually started to record the reaction times. He was curious, why does one person have a different reaction time to a celestial event happening in the sky than another one? And so he was curious about monitoring, measuring, and then also kind of trying to explain why there were these differences. So here I'm going to provide a quick little example. So let's take this one astronomer, and let's say they're peering into their telescope, and they're recording specifically when they see a celestial event. And so Kinbrook, what he did was he recorded this astronomer's reaction time and plotted it on a graph. So here we see on that x-axis the timing of an astronomical event, which could be, let's say, about seconds. And let's say that this specific astronomer, they took about 5 seconds to record that celestial event happening. We could then have another astronomer, a second astronomer, and their reaction time relative to the first astronomer was a little bit slower. I will say it's maybe about 7 seconds. And then we can go on and continue this cycle. So we have a third astronomer who was a little bit slower than the previous one and had a reaction time of about 9 seconds. And then finally, we have a fourth astronomer who also has another reaction time that was very similar to a previous astronomer of about 7 seconds. And so after recording a lot of these reaction times, Kinbrook noticed that these astronomers, or the data that he was collecting from the astronomers, it resembled what's known as a normal distribution. And this is going to be a very important concept that I'm going to come back to in some of the future slides whenever we're talking about achievement testing and things like that. But this really provided the basis for individual differences research. People have different reactions or responses to tests or tasks, and these often follow a normal distribution. And so we often try to explain these individual differences between and even within groups of people with different types of variables, whether that be demographics or other type of psychological constructs. So after this idea of individual differences emerged, at the beginning of the 18th century, some researchers were interested in individual differences and more specifically explaining individual differences among groups of people. One of the most famous or maybe infamous of this time was Sir Francis Galton. And Galton was really interested in measuring more of the physical characteristics. So this idea of our senses and mental imagery. And specifically, he wanted to know how these human characteristics differ between individuals. And Galton found that certain families, in fact, tended to share intellect or intelligence, which demonstrated really a need for him to study intellect and why it differs among different types of people. Another big player was Wilhelm Wundt. So Wundt, he pioneered one of the first psychological labs and was really interested in establishing these quantitative psychological relationships among different constructs. And so Wundt, he didn't actually prescribe to this idea of individual differences. Really what he wanted to do was make these generalizing statements within psychology. And so he really wanted to develop more general laws about human behavior, very similar to what we were finding in the physical sciences at that time. And then finally, within this section, there's also James McKeen Cattell, and he was a huge pioneer in individual differences, specifically in the United States. So Cattell, he took influence from Galton and Wundt in the United States, but he really took after more of Galton's interests in individual differences. And then more specifically with Wundt, he took more of an interest in the psychological processes. So while not necessarily defined or known as intelligence at the time, he tried to study these differences in psychological processes that resembled some features of intelligence tests or what we think about intelligence nowadays. And interestingly, when in some of his studies, one specific one, he found these very small correlations or relationships between test scores from students, specifically at Columbia University. So some very, very smart students, and their reaction time and their speed, for example, of naming colors. And so what he was trying to do was explain some of these potential individual differences in test scores. But what confused him, and upon further investigation, it made sense that these correlations were small. So students specifically at Columbia University had very similar test scores. So this, what we call a restriction of range issue. And these students were very highly selected, best of the best. And so there were really no individual differences that Cattell could pull from the results to try and correlate or show the relationships with other interesting variables. So again, in other words, there was this lack of individual differences. And without that variability in test scores, Cattell wasn't able to demonstrate his hypothesized strong relationships between test scores and other types of cognitive measures like reaction times to certain tasks. Now, Cattell just wasn't using the right test in this case. So it probably could have worked with, maybe different, a larger sample size with other types of students, maybe not those at Columbia with a wider range. But this also demonstrated that test scores were not necessarily the best representation of this behavior that he was getting at. So in other words, Cattell needed a bit of a more challenging distinguishing test to help him explain the individual differences among these highly selective students. So we're talking a little bit about Cattell, and he's getting into this idea of explaining individual differences and specifically intelligence and its relationship to other psychological constructs. But when was intelligence defined? So our first modern conceptualization of intelligence, it kicked off with this French researcher, Alfred Binet. And so further than individual differences between groups of people or within people, Binet studied differences in the same person over time. And he was really trying to understand how do people function as a whole rather than isolating their processes into these little individual components. And so during this time in France specifically, they developed the idea of a universal education. So all students needed to attend school and get an education. However, they didn't really consider children who had mental disabilities within this plan. And so many of the French citizens, they urged their government to put in place something to help these children learn. And so Alfred Binet, he was appointed as the research psychologist to study that phenomenon and figure out how do we tailor curriculum to certain types of students, and more first before that, how do we identify these types of students to give them better curriculum? Now, there was an instance where they did have teacher judgments. So the teachers who were interacting with the students would then select students to be in certain types of classes. But oftentimes they didn't really trust the judgments of these teachers because the way that they were identifying students tended to have some bias in it. So, for example, they would identify students who tended to be disruptive in class or be a class clown as needing some type of remedial education because they really weren't reaching the potential of other students. But maybe perhaps they didn't have the right types of curriculum or opportunities to showcase those talents or knowledge learned in the course. So really this showed the importance of needing a systematic, clearly defined way of identifying students who were below their age level in terms of learning. So Alfred Binet, his goal was to develop a test to identify students who needed those extra educational opportunities without that instructor bias. And so Binet, he did try a bunch of different methods, but among his most successful were these measures of attention and vocabulary and making sense of objects and pictures and stories. So, for example, items on Binet's intelligence tests, and then also his research assistant Simon's, their tests included things like recalling a list of words or completing analogies and defining terms. And so really what he hypothesized was from all of these tasks is that there's one specific factor or general factor of intelligence, which could then be used to subsequently diagnose children and suggest appropriate curriculum. So that kind of moves us a little bit later into someone known as Louis Terman. He was an American psychologist, and he was very interested in Binet's work. Now, specifically, he adapted the Binet-Simon intelligence test around 1916 to be applied in the United States. And this is where we really start to see the emergence of advanced learners and gifted education, and specifically identifying advanced learners. And he was interested in performing a longitudinal study of gifted students. Specifically, he was interested in examining different characteristics that they possessed and their development. So specifically, he examined things like demographic characteristics, like socioeconomic status, parent education level, and family size, as well as things like school performance, such as grades or standardized test scores. He also had a couple other types of outcomes, things like physical health, so their emotional well-being and social relationships, and then more long-term outcomes like their careers, their professions, their aspirations, as well as their achievements and awards within those different fields. So to actually identify those gifted students, Terman used the intelligence quotient, or this idea of the IQ, which was coined by William Stern, another American psychologist. But so the idea of IQ is that a student, they have their mental age, and that can be divided by their chronological age and multiplied by 100. And so that's this intelligence quotient. And that's kind of the score we get from an intelligence test. So basically, let's say that you're 20 years old and your estimated mental age is about 20. And so then via the Stanford Binet intelligence test, your intelligence quotient would be 100. And so that would be considered about average, so right in the middle of this bell curve or normal distribution. And so Terman decided that for a student to be considered gifted or has advanced academic abilities, they needed to have an IQ of at least 140 or higher. And to him, that was an indicator of giftedness. And so you could also think about this as, for example, a 10-year-old having the same average intelligence as a 14-year-old. So really, they showed some advanced capabilities in terms of their intelligence. Now, one of the problems with Stanford Binet's intelligence test is that it was very language dependent. Recall that there were tasks like verbal analogies that were included on the test. And so really that limited the applicability for non-English speakers. So for example, let's say that we had a student from another country, let's say a Spanish-speaking student. They would have a really hard time answering these verbal analogy questions in English And so there was this language barrier there that was impeding them from performing in the way that they were supposed to. And so for this reason, there were other types of intelligence tests, like those of the nonverbal nature that were developed. And so one such nonverbal intelligence test was the Raven's progressive matrices, as you can see on the screen here. And so students are asked to answer visual analogies, and the student has to then decide which is the next appropriate shape given the other shapes within this item or task. Now, unfortunately, with the Raven's progressive matrices, it really only gets at a few constructs or dimensions that are a part of intelligence. So it didn't cover the whole breadth or scope of intelligence like other intelligence tests, similar to that of the Stanford-Binet type of test. So it's a little bit limited in terms of the amount of intelligence that it's telling us or about a student. The Wechsler Intelligence Test for Children, or more commonly known as the WISC, was developed back in 1949. And it did overcome a lot of this limited construct representation challenges associated with Raven's progressive matrices. So it was intentionally designed for about children from the ages of 6 to 16. And this is definitely an important consideration when we're using and making inferences about specific students and their advanced learning potential from those test scores, is what their age is. Whether the test was developed for an adult versus a child is makes quite a bit of a difference. And so the WISC included or does include a few different aspects of intelligence, including verbal comprehension, visual spatial, fluid reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. And in fact, many of these are the WISC is still used today, and it's a pretty standardized measure and comprehensively covers this dimension of intelligence. So intelligence was a huge part of identifying gifted students back in the early days, and still is today. However, the definition of giftedness began to change around the 1950s. And so it no longer included intelligence as just cognitive abilities, but also other aspects that make up giftedness and other dimensions of intelligence. So in 1955, Joy Paul Guilford, he theorized that there was this different type of structure to intelligence. And mainly it included these three different parts or components, which included operations, products, and content. And so operations directly referred to some general types of cognitive processes like memory retention and convergent and divergent thinking. And content, the second area that he thought about in terms of the structure of intelligence, that could be applied in different types of operations. So including semantic or making meaning of words, and the more symbolic representation, so how we perceive and define different words in the alphabet, for example, like different letters. How do we interpret that? Then we also have this product, and that referred to the areas where we apply operations to those specific different content areas. And so that could for example, be like implications where we think about the predictions that we use for knowledge. So really Guilford's work with this new structure of intelligence, it informed an American psychologist named Ellis Paul Torrance, and he developed a test of creativity. And he was pulling from the operations component of Guilford's work. So specifically, he was really focused on this divergent production area, which really had to do with that creativity aspect of it. So on the slide here, you'll see a example task from Torrance's test of creativity. And the student needed to basically combine the shapes. They were all in different circle, triangle, and rectangle. So they were different shapes. And the student was asked to combine the shapes to create a picture. And so the picture that the student created was then assessed by a grader or rater for different characteristics that Guilford hypothesized were related to creativity. And specifically, these included fluency, flexibility, originality, and elaboration. And so fluency, it really referred to this ability to generate a large number of ideas, whereas originality had more to do with producing a unique or unusual ideas. So all of these different dimensions that brought into play creativity. And so Torrance's test development, the development of this creativity test, which was influenced by Guilford pretty heavily in terms of the divergent thinking aspect, was really driven by a need to expand our view, our definition of giftedness. So really, it's not only intelligence that matters, but also creativity, and what we associate with creativity, such as things like problem solving and innovative thinking. So in 1983 now, Howard Gardner, he expanded this view of intelligence even more. And so he took it from this focus on cognitive abilities to a more multifaceted type of view of intelligence. And so while there still are some of the cognitive dimensions represented within Gardner's conceptualization of intelligence, like visual spatial, the mathematical logical, and verbal linguistic, there were other dimensions that Gardner theorized made up intelligence. So these, for example, included ones like musical intelligence, which really focused on a student's ability or a person's ability, really, to associate performance and composition of music and pick out different types of musical patterns, as well as things like naturalistic intelligence, which I thought was a very interesting one. But it really focuses on recognizing and classifying different things in nature, like plants and animals. So Gardner's conceptualization of intelligence, it really expanded the view that giftedness just had to do with these cognitive elements or cognitive abilities. And instead, we're really focusing on strengths that other people have and had, which could then be conceptualized as intelligence. Another sort of different conceptualization that I wanted to bring up here that includes some intelligence aspects to it was presented by Renzulli back in the 70s. And so it included this three-ring view of giftedness specifically. So that was comprised of above average ability, creativity, and task commitment. So creativity here, it refers to that originality and utility of a student's response to a task, while task commitment, it refers to a student's level of motivation and their dedication to completing the task. And I'll come back to that above average ability part in just a minute. But the way that Renzulli conceptualized giftedness, he created a scale for it to try and then assess it. So what we would do is we could perform these different types of systematic observations and then rate the behavioral characteristics associated with certain areas of giftedness. And this could be used across from verbal to quantitative to different aspects, all the way from not just learning or advanced learning capabilities, but things like music and sports and things like that. And so this conception of giftedness was broader than just intelligence. And it was also a little bit more inclusive in that it overcame some of the biases associated with intelligence tests, specifically for students with more diverse types of backgrounds. And it allowed students to exhibit and be rated on their creativity and their commitment to create or completing a task in the classroom. And so for this reason, it gave us a little bit more of an authentic view or understanding of students and whether they had advanced learning capabilities and needed or would benefit from acceleration and enrichment types of programs. Now, one part of Renzulli's conceptualization that I didn't really expand on was this idea of above average ability. And so this can refer to general intelligence, like we talked about before, but we can also think about it in terms of achievement tests. So this brings us back to our fun Venn diagrams, specifically the intelligence tests that we talked about. Those involve measuring constructs that had to do with more innate or challenging to change types of features and constructs. So they were really things that tended to stay same across a student at a certain age and past that. Whereas this achievement tests, again, they really have to do with more of your demonstration of learned material. So did you learn the material? So for example, at CTY, we use the school and college ability test to identify students using a quantitative as well as a verbal domain. And this is considered an achievement test. And so these different types of achievement tests I'm going to talk about, well, there's two of them. One is the above grade level test, and then these the other is a norm reference type of test. But first we'll get into a above grade level type of test. So when with an above grade level test, we really are trying to see how a student would perform relative to students in an older peer group. So let's say, for example, that we have a fifth grade student and they take a test with eighth grade content. And then let's say that we have our sample of eighth grade students who also completed that eighth grade test. And their scores, as we can see on this graph, are pretty normally distributed, which is pretty typical. And then what we can see, or really what we're interested in, is where the fifth grade student fell relative to the other eighth grade students. And so we're really trying to then make an inference about their above grade level knowledge. So they're a fifth grade student. How do they compare to students in eighth grade taking the same test with that same above grade level content? Now, if they scored way above most of the eighth grade students, then this really could be an indication, so way above in terms of the average of eighth grade students, this could really be an indication of advanced learning potential and that they really could benefit from acceleration and enrichment programs. Now, in contrast to the above grade level tests, another typical type of achievement test is a norm reference test. And norm reference tests, they have to do with how students score relative to one another within their same peer group. So for example, let's say that we had that same fifth grade student who also completed a fifth grade test. And so we can examine here, again, where did this fifth grade student fall relative to the other fifth grade students or those similar to their peer group? And more specifically, we're really interested in seeing, did they fall in this top percentile? So here again, we have that average test score for fifth grade students. We really are more interested now, are they falling in this top percentile or at the very, very tail end of this normal curve? And so while these above grade level and norm reference tests, they can tell us a lot about the student's rate of learning, so whether they picked up the material and whether they can demonstrate learning that material. The content tends to be really dependent on material that's learned in school. And so oftentimes, some students, they don't necessarily have the opportunity to learn that material in the same way as other students, which can then negatively impact their test scores. And this is problematic if certain groups of students with less opportunities to learn are not being identified as often as they should be. And this is due to really irrelevant things that the students can't control. And so it starts to bring into question the validity or the use of these test scores. And so one solution here was to develop identification tools and assessments that could be used in the classroom where active learning actually occurs. And so there was then this shift from, more of the intelligence or aptitude and achievement tests to some what we call authentic assessments. And so rather than relying on multiple choice tests, for example, we can use things like performance-based assessments to help identify and suggest acceleration and enrichment opportunities to advanced learners. And so they're more authentic because we can better cover this definition and assess the characteristics that we typically associate with advanced learners, things like curiosity, problem solving, creative thinking. And these characteristics, they tend to be a little bit more challenging to measure using things like a typical achievement test or a multiple choice test is probably a better example of that. And so some examples of performance assessments could be things like portfolios or rubrics. And specifically in the case of rubrics, students, they're asked to complete a task or assignment. And then what the instructor does is that they rate the student product, so their final creation, or the process that they used to arrive at an answer. And this, again, it's a little bit more authentic because it helps us to measure some of these higher order constructs or thoughts, dimensions, ideas that are challenging to measure using a typical multiple choice test. And additionally, the setting itself is actually a little bit more authentic when we think about it. basically, the student is in the classroom, they're learning the material, and they're able to show how they learned that material, and that is what is being assessed to then infer whether certain opportunities would be good for that student or whether they have advanced learning capabilities. So some of the downsides, though, to performance assessments or performance-based assessments are that they tend to rely, or that they're time-consuming for that instructor and or teacher to rate every single student on their task and activities. So it takes a lot of time for the instructors to do that. Additionally, while we can develop a rubric, which provides that specific set of standardized definitions and criteria for the instructor, it can still bring about some bias when rating student work, especially if the instructor knows who the student is, and things like that. So another way to view and rate the learning process to better help us match students to appropriate learning opportunities is something known as a dynamic assessment. And these are a little bit more relevant and coming about in more recent years. So really, dynamic assessments, they help us to assess a student's capacity to learn rather than just simply whether they learned the material. So learning potential and that ability to improve really with feedback is what we're trying to go here, what we're trying to get at here in terms of assessing a student's capacity to learn. So these types of tools, they typically begin with a pretest. And so we're trying to see, where did the student start off before entering the classroom or experiencing some type of intervention? And then the student, they complete curriculum or an learning intervention. And really there, that is the active learning. So are they learning the material? How quickly do they learn it? Things like that. And then ultimately, we see this post-test, and it really is getting at, where did the student end? So from the pre-test to the post-test, we want to see how much material did the student learn as a result of the curriculum. So we're really seeing this capacity to learn, and this can be, applied in many different types of situations. But again, this is just one example of assessing a student's capacity to learn and how it's a little bit more dynamic in terms of trying to understand their learning potential. And so depending on the the different types of tests that we develop, we can also see whether students were able to pick up the material at a quick rate and things like that. So overall, there's been a rich history of advanced learner identification methods. We started off in ancient China, in ancient Greece, with the first instances of testing, and then we really shifted gears to the 18th century and explored this idea of individual differences and the advent of intelligence testing. And so the rise of intelligence testing, it also gave rise to our notions of giftedness and what it means for a student to be gifted. And this evolved then into using achievement tests of things like achievement tests of creativity, performance-based assessments, and dynamic assessments. And I should mention here, I didn't necessarily review all of the tests or identification tools associated with advanced learners and in the field of advanced learning, but really this kind of gives us a bit of a better understanding of where we've been and how we can kind of go on from here. So really, I think one of the important takeaway messages that I want to emphasize is really what is causing this shift. So what causes, us to think about new identification methods and tools. And ultimately, all of these new identification tools were developed to address the new ways that we conceptualize what makes an advanced learner an advanced learner. And it's important here that we build on these tools as our conceptualization of advanced learning evolves and changes. And more specifically, I think that it's important that we focus on providing the right opportunities to students, regardless of their demographic or background. And so it's really important to build the tools to try and help all types of students and really create pathways for them. And so with that, I am going to pass it over to Amy Shelton.
Thank you, Kathryn. Fantastic. So Kathryn set me up beautifully. So what I'm going to do in this last little bit is actually talk a little bit about where we go from here. And what I want to do is take what Kathryn has just talked about and give a little bit of a context on the perspective of sort of how are we thinking about this going forward. And our goal really is to innovate on the identification. And where Kathryn just showed you this nice progression of how we've kind of developed many tools, what I'm going to suggest is we now need to harness that in a very specific way. And when we think about this perspective, the first thing I want to say is that when you're trying to tackle identification, it can be very easy to think our question is, how do we find advanced learners? And I think to really dig into what Kathryn was just saying about how we think about it is that rather than thinking about how we find advanced learners, let's think about how we match them to appropriate opportunities. And when you do that, it means things like one measure is not going to fit all students, and one measure is not going to fit all opportunities. So if our goal really is to understand what students need and to then serve those needs, we need to be very thoughtful about what tools we're using. And then I want to go further to say that at places like CTY as well as others, identification has long been viewed as a gatekeeper. And in reality, identification should be a pathfinder. And so that's kind of the context in which we're going to talk about some of these things. And I'm going to suggest, as Kathryn was kind of noting, that we have a lot of tools. And our goal should really be to establish a toolbox. And I talk about this in light of sort of a purposeful and equitable toolbox. And purposeful in this case is defined as what are the opportunities you're trying to identify for? So what is it you're trying to do for students? And so when you want to talk about purpose, you start by saying, okay, well, what is purposeful identification? What are the elements? First is just the very basics. What's your population or populations of interest? So what are their ages? What are their grade levels? Where are they located? Are there constraints based on those things? And that's just sort of a straight up, you need to kind of know who you're trying to look for. And once you've done that, then you can start to think about purposeful identification in terms of things like the role of domain. And domain here really refers to how much do you need domain specific versus domain general. And so domain general would be sort of that general idea of we're looking for people just at the high end of ability, something like high IQ. And we can think about that as more general and sort of just that open-ended, as a yes or no. A student falls into this category or does not. And you can have some gradations in there, but you're not talking about specific areas of ability. You're talking about very generally, what is this designed for? Is it designed for multiple domains of ability? Or is it designed for more general advanced reasoning? Is it something that just kind of knowing you're in that top sort of nebulous category is enough? The second area is domain-specific ability. And in this case, you can have students advanced in advanced in specific areas. And so this can be advanced in one or more areas. For example, you could have a student who, like student 2 here, who's advanced in both quantitative and verbal reasoning, or you can have individuals who sort of differ. Maybe they're average on verbal reasoning, but advanced in quantitative. And you could go even deeper than that by having more types of matching. And so in this case, you talk about opportunities that really are designed for specific domains of ability. So it can be that you require quantitative reasoning, or that this is an opportunity tailored really well for quantitative reasoning. Or it could be that this works to have any domain, meaning perhaps it's an opportunity where just being strong in one area is enough to carry you through that opportunity. So one of the first questions in purposeful beyond the basics is to say, well, what are you talking about? Are you talking about this domain general or domain specific kind of ability? The second part of purposeful identification then is one that we spend a lot of time on, which is the role of differentiation. And we can think of advanced learners as either being sort of general, all in one category of ability. So it's a little different from general intelligence, meaning that rather than saying you are advanced, period, do we need to stretch that out? Do we need to think about it? And so you can have general advanced ability where you just know they're in the upper tail, and that would match to opportunities like places where it's okay to be somewhat heterogeneous, or where there are scaffolds for those that might be in different places within the space. So that would be opportunities where you don't need to differentiate. Alternatively, you can have the need for different levels of advanced ability, which is the way CTY actually operates, where we take that tail of the distribution, and as Kathryn is noting, we take above grade level testing and try to see where in that space you are. And that allows us to actually tailor to specific levels of rigor and challenge. We can tailor the pace and scope and make sure that it really is targeted to that specific subgroup. And there's a lot of evidence from our past work showing that that's an important feature of a CTY course. And so knowing whether you're doing this something that can allow for advanced learning, but heterogeneous advanced learning versus you need to tailor it. And at CTY, we actually have a combination of those things. And so knowing the specifics helps. And then the last last point in purposeful identification is the role that content knowledge plays. So a lot of time when we talk about identification, we look at things like achievement tests versus aptitude, and naturally people say, well, aptitude tests must be better because they don't require content. That's not necessarily true, because there are opportunities for which being prepared for the content itself is important. So when you look at the role of content, you have to ask, is this an opportunity where you're trying to require foundational knowledge or not? So if it's limited, it might be opportunities where you're building skills or introducing content and allowing scaffolding for different content levels, versus cases where the foundational knowledge really is required and you're matching to opportunities where it might be like accelerated pace in an advanced content like fast-paced science, where prerequisites really are an important role. Oops, it literally just bounced me out of my slides. What is this? Whoop, sorry about that. No idea why it jumped. Okay, so what you do then is you can think about this as purposeful, meaning that we can look at the role of content, we can look at the role of the domain, and then whether or not we need to differentiate. So that's purposeful. The other part of it is equitable, and that's how well are you capturing the students who will thrive in these opportunities. And if there's one thing we know is that we have a distinct challenge in the field of gifted education, particularly along race, ethnicity, and income, and often at the intersection of those two, though not exclusively. What I mean by that is we know that advanced learners come from every community and every demographic. They cross racial, ethnic, cultural, economic lines. If you can reach to those students and find them, that these students are out there. And we know that there's a giant disproportionality that has occurred in gifted education programs in the US over many years. And this is represented by the overrepresentation of white and Asian students relative to Black and Latinx. That's kind of a summary version of it. There's deeper information there, but also overrepresentation of families in the higher economic categories. And given this, we know that this means we need to think about that representation and how it plays out. And it turns out there are similar issues in many international settings, whether it's specifically race and ethnicity, whether it's cultural groups, class systems, whether it's strictly economic bounds. And so we need to really think about how that impacts our testing. And then there's another set of additional factors, and I don't mean to diminish these, I just don't elaborate on them as much, in part because we want to get to questions. First is twice exceptionality, those students who are experiencing learning challenges. Students who are English language learners may not come from an English-speaking background, and many of our programs are English-speaking programs. Cultural attitudes towards standardized testing. When we first started our work with Greece, we found that that was not a culture where timed testing was meaningful. And so given that we need to do this equitable identification, we've got purposeful and we got equitable, where does that take us? And so the next thing we'd say is, all right, this is what we need. We need age and grade appropriate assessments. We need assessments of general versus domain specific, because different people are going to have different needs. We're going to want in-grade or above-grade assessments if you need to do the differentiation or you don't. We need this whole range from aptitude to achievement to deal with content knowledge. And then we need to have things that are opportunity dependent versus independent to understand that role of gaps and preparedness. And in particular, really getting into that space of how can we get to that opportunity independence to be more equitable. And then finally, we need to have measures that are sensitive to issues of cultural relevance, language, et cetera. So when you think about each of these, this is telling us that depending on the opportunity you're offering and the target populations you want to work with and how you want to deal with underrepresentation, we need to have a range of tools. And Kathryn alluded to many of these. I'm not going to go into any detail on them, but there are many different options right now. We have a lot of domain general standardized tests, like the IQ tests. We have domain-specific standardized tests like the SAT, the ACT, the SCAT that we use, many of the other tests, the COGAT, where you can actually look at things like quantitative and verbal reasoning, or you can look at nonverbal reasoning. We need to look at things. There are domain-specific placement tests. There is universal screening where that's sort of a way to use the test. As Kathryn, there are things like looking at fundamental cognitive skills. There are these performance-based things like portfolios and teacher evals. And then the deeper one, which is the course-based assessments, which is sort of a new version of the dynamic assessment space. And when we think about all these tools, all of these have potential relevance if used well. Now, many of them come with problems, and we could have a whole nother discussion on what some of those problems are. But starting from a place of what is this toolbox and how do we use it is an important one. And then once we have that, we can talk about, well, what do we need to do with all of this? And the first thing I would say is we actually need to do more work on those existing tools. As I just said, some of them really are clearly problematic. And so we need to start by cataloging what we have, thinking about what works when, where, and for which students in our space. Then we need to really address novel ways to think about testing. So as Kathryn alluded, some of it is, what do we really want to know? And so there are lots of areas worth looking at, such as problem solving in action. So this is a version of dynamically assessing what's going on. Looking at cross-cultural and cross-language assessments. Can we get away from things that require language? If you're studying verbal skills, maybe not. How do we implement educator training to play an important role in this? We have many educators who do know this space well. Can we get more formalized rubrics so you can start doing more identification sort of in vivo in the classroom? And then one area that we haven't talked about, but that is really top of mind for us here at CTY is the implementation of AI tools, using artificial intelligence as a part of the toolbox, whether it's machine learning or aspects of generative AI. How do those tools augment what we do? So I would never want to suggest that you have to take the human component out. Educators and those of us who have been in the field many years know that even, there's no AI engine that's going to replace the knowledge of educators. They're going to have to be a part of the story. It may feel that way sometimes, but when you look deeply, it's really going to be, at its best, AI is used as an augmenting tool. And so there's lots of spaces within our identification where that could be the case. And we have several projects, some of which you can hear about in our other events this week. But we are aggressively thinking about how all these kind of wrap together. And then finally, another area we really need to think about is pipelines. So a lot of what I've said is sort of about a matching to an immediate product, meaning like I've got a program I want to offer, I need to know how to match students to it. And in that case, I can sort of choose a specific tool. But we should also be thinking about how the tools, if we back those up and say we want to create pipelines for students and pathways for students, our identification needs to acknowledge where in the stream are we starting and where do we want to get them to, both in identification and in programs. So that marriage between the identification tools and the programs is critical. So with that, I want to say thank you on behalf of me and Kathryn, and hopefully Kathryn will come back on screen for us. There are other events that cover some of the topics we've touched on here. I've got the QR code for that here. But with that, I want to say thank you so much for being here. We're excited that we're celebrating 45 years here at CTY, and identification is a critical piece of that. And with that, I believe we're turning it over to Emily for our Q&A.
Yes, thank you again so much, Kathryn and Amy. That was really informative and was honestly a great way to kind of start off the conversation and lead up for the next few sessions that will be happening over the next few days. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and